The morning I realized I was locked out of my own home, the air felt colder than it should have been. I remember standing on the porch, holding the same key I had used for 15 years, pushing it into the lock again and again, as if the door itself might suddenly remember who I was. But the key wouldn't turn, not even a little. At first, I thought it was just an old lock jammed by the cold. But then I noticed something strange. The metal around the lock looked new.
Shiny.
Untouched by time. Someone had changed it. And deep down, before I even reached for my phone, before I even knocked on the door, before I even heard the footsteps inside the house, I already knew who had done it.
My daughter-in-law.
And the worst part? This wasn't the first time she tried to erase me from my own life. But what she didn't know that morning, standing there with the curtains slightly moving behind the window, was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is a trap. And that day, the truth was about to walk through the door, wearing a police badge. My name is Evelyn, and for most of my life I believed that family meant loyalty. I believed that if you loved people enough, if you sacrificed enough, if you stayed patient through the difficult seasons, everything would eventually find its way back to peace. That is what I taught my son when he was young. That is the kind of woman I tried to be. But life has a strange way of testing the values you think are unbreakable. When my son Daniel married Clara, I truly believed she would become part of our family. At the beginning, she smiled often, called me Mom, and brought flowers when she visited. I remember thinking that perhaps God had blessed us with someone who would bring warmth into Daniel's life. But warmth can fade. And sometimes what looks like kindness is simply patience waiting for the right moment. The changes started slowly. Small comments. Small distances. Little moments where I felt like a guest in my own home instead of the woman who had built it with 20 years of work and sacrifice. At first I ignored it. Then I forgave it. Then I pretended not to see it. But what happened the day she changed the locks on my house, that was the moment everything finally came into the light. And if you've ever wondered how quiet betrayal can become something much bigger than anger, stay with me, because what happened next changed our entire family forever. The morning the locks changed was colder than usual, even though the sun had already begun to rise over the quiet street where I had lived for nearly 2 decades. I remember the silence most of all. The kind of silence that only exists in neighborhoods where people leave for work early and the houses sit still for hours afterward. I had gone out the night before to visit a friend from church, something I rarely did anymore, and when I returned home the next morning after stopping for coffee, I noticed something felt different before I even reached the door. The air felt heavier. The house looked the same from the outside, the same white porch railing, the same flower pots I had planted every spring, but something inside me told me the rhythm of the place had shifted. When I placed my key into the lock, it slid in smoothly, but when I tried to turn it, the metal resisted me like a stranger refusing to open a door. I pulled the key out, looked at it, and tried again. Nothing. I twisted harder this time, thinking perhaps the lock had frozen overnight, but the key simply spun uselessly in place. That was when I leaned closer and noticed the lock itself looked newer than I remembered. The brass shined in a way it never had before, polished and untouched, like it had been installed only hours earlier. My hand stayed on the doorknob for several seconds as the realization slowly settled into my chest like a stone sinking to the bottom of water. I knocked on the door once, gently at first, the way you knock when you believe someone inside simply hasn't heard you arrive. Then I knocked again, louder this time. I could hear faint movement inside the house. Footsteps. Someone was clearly there. The curtains near the living room window shifted slightly, and for just a moment, I saw the shadow of someone standing behind them, watching me, waiting. But the door never opened. Instead, the footsteps retreated deeper into the house, leaving me standing alone on the porch of the place I had built with my own hands. For 15 years, that house had been my entire world. I worked overtime shifts at the hospital to pay the mortgage after my husband passed away. I painted those walls myself when the budget was too tight to hire anyone. Every room carried memories of my son Daniel growing up, from the scratches in the hallway where he rode his toy trucks to the kitchen table where he studied late into the night during his college years. That house was not just a building. It was the proof of everything I had sacrificed to give my son a stable life. And now I was standing outside of it like a stranger asking permission to enter. The first name that crossed my mind was Clara. My daughter-in-law had moved in only 6 months earlier after Daniel insisted they needed a place to save money for a bigger home. At the time, I welcomed them without hesitation. I told Daniel that families should always help each other, and I truly believed it. But over the past few months, Clara's attitude toward me had slowly changed. Small comments about privacy, little complaints about how often I used the kitchen, subtle remarks that made it sound like I was the guest in the house instead of the woman who owned it. At first, I dismissed it as tension between generations, the kind of thing families eventually work through. But standing there on the porch, staring at that unfamiliar lock, I suddenly realized those small moments had been warnings. I knocked one last time, harder than before, my knuckles striking the wood with a sound that echoed down the empty street. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the door opened just a few inches, stopped by the security chain. Clara's face appeared through the narrow gap, her expression calm in a way that immediately unsettled me. She didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, she looked prepared. "Clara," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady, "my key isn't working." She tilted her head slightly, studying me like someone evaluating a stranger rather than speaking to her husband's mother. Behind her, I could see the living room I knew so well. The couch, the bookshelf. Everything looked exactly the same. Everything except the distance in her eyes. "Oh," she replied after a short pause, her voice almost casual. "Yes, we changed the locks last night." The words landed quietly, but their meaning felt enormous. For a moment, I thought I must have misunderstood her. People don't change the locks on someone else's house without explanation. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding I could clear up with a simple conversation. But when I opened my mouth to ask why, Clara spoke again before I could finish the sentence. "Daniel and I talked about it," she said, her tone suddenly colder. "We think it's better if you stay somewhere else for a while." The porch seemed to shrink beneath my feet. Stay somewhere else. In my own home. I could hear Daniel's voice faintly somewhere deeper in the house, but he didn't come to the door. He didn't even say my name. And in that moment, I understood something that hurt far more than the lock itself. My son was inside, and he was letting this happen. For several seconds, I said nothing. I simply looked at Clara through the small opening of the chained door while the morning sunlight stretched across the porch floor between us. She waited for me to argue. I could see it in her posture, almost as if she expected a scene, expected anger, expected me to raise my voice so she could justify what she had already decided. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded slowly, stepped back from the door, and placed my useless key back into my pocket. "All right," I said quietly. Clara seemed almost confused by the calm in my voice. She hesitated for a moment before closing the door again, the click of the new lock echoing in the silence of the street. What she didn't know, what none of them knew at that moment, was that the house was still legally mine. And the decision they had just made would soon bring consequences none of them were prepared for. After the door closed, I stood on the porch for a few seconds longer than I needed to. Not because I expected it to open again, but because part of me was still trying to understand how a moment like that could exist in real life. The house in front of me was the same house I had left the night before, yet suddenly it felt like a completely different place. The curtains moved slightly again, and I knew Clara was still watching from inside. Perhaps she expected me to shout, to demand entry, to create the kind of scene neighbors remember for years. But I simply turned around and walked down the steps slowly, the same way I had walked down them thousands of times before. The cold morning air touched my face as I reached the sidewalk, and only then did the full weight of what had happened begin to settle inside my chest. I wasn't angry yet. Anger usually arrives later, after the shock fades. What I felt first was something quieter, something heavier. It was the strange realization that the people inside that house had already made their decision long before that morning. The lock had only been the final step of a plan that must have been forming in silence for weeks, maybe even months. My car was still parked in the driveway, exactly where I had left it the night before. I walked toward it slowly, my shoes scraping against the gravel as the morning sun continued rising over the rooftops. The neighborhood was beginning to wake up. A man 2 houses down was picking up his newspaper. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence. Life was continuing as if nothing unusual had happened, yet my entire world had shifted in less than 5 minutes. I sat inside the car and closed the door, letting the quiet surround me. For a moment, I rested my hands on the steering wheel without turning the engine on. My eyes drifted back toward the house through the windshield. From this angle, I could see the upstairs window of Daniel's old bedroom. The same room where he once hung posters of airplanes when he dreamed of becoming a pilot. The same room where I sat with him on the floor during long nights helping him study for exams. Those memories didn't disappear just because someone had changed a lock. And that was the part Clara didn't understand. You can change a door. You can change a lock. But you cannot erase history. After a few minutes, I started the car and pulled slowly out of the driveway. I didn't look back as I drove away, not because I didn't care, but because I knew that looking back would only invite emotions that would cloud my judgment. Clara expected anger. She expected confrontation. What she didn't expect was patience. And patience can be far more dangerous than anger. As I drove through the quiet streets of the neighborhood, I began replaying the past few months in my mind. The small arguments Clara had started about space in the house. The subtle ways she spoke about their future, always describing it as if I was an obstacle standing in the middle of it. At the time, I believed Daniel would eventually step in and calm the tension. My son had always been a reasonable man. But recently, he had started avoiding those conversations entirely. When Clara complained, he simply stayed silent. Now I understood why. Silence can mean many things in a family. Sometimes it means peace.
Sometimes it means respect.
But sometimes silence means agreement. And that morning, standing outside the door while Clara spoke through the security chain, my son's silence inside the house had told me everything I needed to know. I stopped at a small coffee shop about 10 minutes away, the same place I often visited on quiet mornings after church. The owner, an older man named Miguel, greeted me the moment I stepped inside. He had known me for years and usually joked that I drank coffee like someone half my age. But that morning he studied my face carefully before speaking. "You look tired today, Evelyn," he said gently while pouring coffee into a mug. I smiled politely and thanked him, choosing a small table near the window where the sunlight touched the floor. The warmth of the coffee cup in my hands felt grounding, something solid in the middle of a situation that suddenly felt unreal. For a while I simply sat there watching cars pass by outside, letting the quiet help me think clearly. Because one thing was already certain in my mind. Clara believed she had won. She believed changing the locks meant she had taken control of the house. She believed I would react emotionally, make mistakes, and perhaps even leave quietly to avoid conflict with my own son. But Clara had never seen the documents locked in my desk drawer. She had never read the property title. She had never spoken to the lawyer who helped me prepare for situations exactly like this one. You see, when my husband passed away years earlier, I learned something important about life. Family love is beautiful, but legal ownership is clearer. And as I took another sip of coffee that morning, watching the sunlight slowly grow brighter through the cafe window, I realized something Clara would soon learn the hard way. Changing the locks had been the easiest part of her plan. The consequences were about to begin. The coffee shop slowly filled with people as the morning continued, but I barely noticed the conversations around me. My mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying every moment that had led to that locked door. Betrayal rarely happens suddenly. It grows quietly, like a crack in a wall that begins so small you barely notice it until one day the entire structure gives way. Looking back, the signs had been there. Clara had never truly seen that house as my home. In her mind, it had already become something else.
Something she planned to take.
I finished my coffee slowly, letting the warmth settle in my chest before standing up. Miguel glanced at me again as I walked toward the counter, and I could tell he wanted to ask if everything was all right. But he didn't. Some people understand that certain questions should wait until the person asking them is ready to answer. I paid for the coffee, thanked him, and stepped back into the morning light. The air felt warmer now, but but the heaviness in my thoughts remained. I walked back to my car and sat inside again, this time pulling my phone from my purse. For several seconds, I stared at Daniel's name on the screen. My son. The boy I had raised alone after losing his father. The boy who once promised me he would always protect me the way I had protected him. It would have been easy to call him right then, to demand answers, to force him to explain why he allowed something like this to happen. But I didn't press the call button. Not yet. Because the truth is, I already understood what had happened. Daniel was not the kind of man who would suddenly decide to lock his own mother out of her house, without influence. Clara had been shaping this moment carefully.
Slowly. Strategically.
The small comments about space, the quiet arguments about privacy, the way she often suggested Daniel and I needed boundaries. All of it had been leading here, and Daniel had simply followed the path she built. I placed the phone back into my purse and started the car again. There were more important steps to take before any emotional conversations could happen. Anger might bring temporary satisfaction, but strategy brings results. Years of working in the hospital had taught me that when chaos appears, the calmest person in the room usually ends up with the most control. And I intended to remain calm. I drove across town toward a quiet office building near the courthouse. The sign outside the building was simple, nothing flashy, just a brass plate beside the door that read the name of a law firm I had visited several times over the years. When my husband passed away, I had spent months organizing financial documents, insurance policies, and property titles. It was not something most people enjoy thinking about, but grief teaches you quickly that preparation matters, especially when family is involved. I walked into the office and greeted the receptionist, who recognized me immediately. She smiled politely and asked if I had an appointment, and I explained that I didn't but hoped Mr. Lawson might have a few minutes to speak with me. A short phone call later, she gestured toward the hallway and told me he was available. Mr. Lawson stood up from behind his desk when I entered his office. He was older now than when we first met years ago, but his calm presence remained exactly the same. Lawyers who spend decades working with families develop a certain way of reading people's faces before a word is spoken. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "what happened?" I sat down across from his desk and took a slow breath before answering. "My daughter-in-law changed the locks on my house this morning," I said quietly. He didn't look surprised. Instead, he simply leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together thoughtfully, the way someone does when they are already beginning to assemble the pieces of a puzzle. "Did you confront them?" he asked. "No," I replied. I left. For the first time since I entered the room, a faint smile appeared on his face. That was the right decision. He opened a file cabinet behind his desk and pulled out a familiar folder containing copies of documents we had prepared years earlier. The sound of papers sliding across his desk felt strangely reassuring, like the steady ticking of a clock reminding you that time is still moving forward. "You still hold full ownership of the property," he said while reviewing the papers. "The house was never transferred to your son's name." "That's correct," I answered. He nodded slowly. "Then, legally speaking," he continued, "they had absolutely no authority to change the locks." Hearing those words didn't bring me joy. It didn't even bring satisfaction. What it brought was clarity. Clara believed she had taken control of the house. But legally, she had just created a situation that could turn very serious. Mr. Lawson closed the folder and looked at me carefully. "If you want to regain access to your home," he said calmly, "there are several ways to proceed." For a moment the room felt very quiet. Because at that exact moment, somewhere across town, Clara was probably sitting comfortably inside my living room, believing the door she locked behind me that morning would never open again. She had no idea how wrong she was. And the knock that would soon arrive at that same door would not be from me. Mr. Lawson didn't rush the conversation. Lawyers who deal with family conflicts know that people rarely come to their offices only for legal advice. They come because something personal has broken, and the law simply becomes the tool used to deal with the damage. He leaned back in his chair, studying the documents in front of him again while the quiet ticking of a small clock on the wall filled the room. "Let me ask you something first," he said calmly. "Did they threaten you in any way? Or did they simply refuse to let you inside?" "They told me to stay somewhere else for a while," I answered. "Through a chained door." He nodded slowly, making a few notes on a yellow legal pad beside the file. That's important, he said, because what they've done can fall under unlawful exclusion from a property, especially considering you are the legal owner and they are living there with your permission. The word permission echoed in my mind for a moment. That had been the entire foundation of the situation. I had allowed Daniel and Clara to move into the house. I had believed helping them save money for their future was the right thing to do. At the time it felt natural, like something any mother would do for her son. But permission, once given, is often misunderstood by the person receiving it. Some people start believing generosity is weakness. Mr. Lawson turned the folder toward me, so I could see the property title printed clearly on the first page. Your name is the only one on this document, he said, which means the house legally belongs to you. No one can remove you from your own property without a court order. I looked at the paper quietly for a moment. It felt strange that something so simple, a sheet of printed words and signatures, could carry so much weight in a situation that felt deeply emotional. But that is the nature of law. It removes feelings from the equation and replaces them with facts. And what happens now? I asked. He folded his hands again and spoke in the same calm tone he had used since the beginning of our meeting. There are several options, he explained. You could file a civil complaint. That would begin a legal process where the court orders them to restore your access to the property. But that can take time. I nodded slightly. Time was something Clara probably believed she had plenty of. Mr. Lawson continued. There is also another possibility, he said. Because the locks were changed while the legal owner was absent and access was intentionally denied, the situation could involve law enforcement. In some cases, the police will accompany the property owner to restore entry. For a brief moment, the image formed clearly in my mind. A police officer standing at the same door where Clara had spoken through the security chain that morning. The same door she believed now belonged to her. What would you recommend? I asked quietly. Mr. Lawson studied my face carefully before answering. Lawyers develop a skill for understanding not just the legal question being asked, but the emotional one hiding behind it. Mrs. Carter, he said gently, the real question is not what I recommend. The real question is what outcome you want. That sentence stayed in the air between us for several seconds. Because he was right. Did I want revenge? Did I want to humiliate Clara in front of the neighbors? Did I want to drag my own son through a legal battle that could destroy what remained of our relationship? Those were questions no lawyer could answer. I thought about Daniel again. The boy who once ran through the backyard chasing fireflies on summer evenings. The teenager who sat at our kitchen table studying late into the night while I brewed coffee for both of us. The young man who hugged me the day he graduated college and promised he would make me proud. Somewhere between those memories and the moment Clara closed the door on me that morning, something had changed. But love doesn't disappear overnight. It simply becomes quieter. I don't want to destroy my son, I said softly. Mr. Lawson nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then the best approach, he replied, is to restore the situation legally without escalating it emotionally. If the police accompany you to the property, they will simply enforce the law. They will inform everyone present that the homeowner must be allowed inside. And Clara? I asked. He shrugged slightly. She will learn something important about ownership. I leaned back in the chair, letting the thought settle. Clara had expected anger. She had expected confrontation. What she didn't expect was patience followed by quiet authority. Mr. Lawson closed the folder and slid it back into the cabinet behind him. If you'd like, he said, I can contact the local police department and explain the situation so they understand the legal context before you arrive. For a moment, I imagined Clara moving around my kitchen that morning, perhaps making coffee, perhaps believing she had finally established control over the house. Maybe she was already planning how the rooms would be arranged once I was completely gone. Maybe she believed the story she told herself, that the house was now part of her future. But the law doesn't care about stories. The law cares about facts. And the fact was simple. The house still belonged to me. Yes, I said calmly. Let's do that. Mr. Lawson reached for his phone. And somewhere across town, completely unaware of what was about to happen, Clara was sitting comfortably inside a house she believed she had successfully taken. She had no idea that before the afternoon ended, someone else would be knocking on that same door. Mr. Lawson made the call calmly, speaking in the same measured tone he had used during our entire conversation. He explained the situation clearly to someone on the other end of the line, referencing the property title and the fact that the legal homeowner had been intentionally locked out. I sat quietly across from his desk while he spoke, listening to only one side of the conversation. From the fragments I could hear, it was clear that this was not the first time the police department had encountered something like this. When he finished the call, he placed the phone back on the desk and looked at me. "They're aware of the situation now," he said. "If you go to the house this afternoon, an officer can meet you there to help restore access." The words were simple, but their meaning carried weight. This situation, which had started as a quiet act behind a locked door that morning, was about to move into the open. Clara had probably believed she could keep everything contained inside the walls of the house. But the moment law enforcement became involved, secrecy disappeared. I stood up slowly, thanking Mr. Lawson for his help. He walked me to the door of his office, pausing for a moment before I stepped out into the hallway. "One more thing," he said gently. "When situations like this unfold, emotions tend to surface quickly. The best thing you can do is remain calm. Let the officer handle the conversation." I nodded. Calmness had already become my greatest advantage. When I left the office building, the afternoon sun was high above the courthouse square, and the streets were busier than they had been earlier that morning. People moved in and out of small shops, cars passed steadily through the intersections, and life continued without any awareness of the quiet storm forming around a small white house across town. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine again. This time, however, the feeling inside me had changed. The confusion and disbelief from earlier had settled into something more stable. I now understood the structure of what was happening. Clara had made a bold move, but bold moves sometimes come from people who don't fully understand the consequences behind them. And consequences were now beginning to take shape. The drive back toward my neighborhood felt strangely familiar, yet different at the same time. The same streets, the same trees lining the sidewalks, the same houses that had been part of my daily life for years. But now I was returning not as someone quietly walking back into her routine. I was returning with the law behind me. When I turned onto my street, I immediately noticed Clara's car parked in the driveway. Daniel's truck was there too. That meant both of them were inside the house. For a moment, I simply parked along the curb across the street and watched the house from a distance. Everything looked peaceful. The curtains were half open. The front porch looked exactly the same as it had that morning. From the outside, no one passing by would suspect that anything unusual had happened at all. But appearances can be misleading. About 10 minutes later, a police cruiser slowly turned the corner and pulled up behind my car. The officer stepped out and approached calmly, adjusting his hat as he walked toward my window. He looked to be in his early 40s, with the calm posture of someone who had handled many uncomfortable situations over the years. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, stepping out of the car. He nodded and glanced briefly toward the house across the street. "I spoke with Mr. Lawson," he said. He explained the situation. I appreciated the fact that his tone remained neutral. He wasn't here to take sides emotionally. He was here to enforce what the law already made clear. "That's my house," I said quietly, pointing toward the porch. The officer studied the property for a moment before turning back toward me. "All right," he replied. "Let's go talk to them." We walked across the street together, our footsteps echoing lightly against the pavement. As we approached the porch, I felt the same wooden boards beneath my shoes that I had stood on earlier that morning. The same boards Clara had closed the door against. But this time I wasn't alone. The officer knocked firmly on the door, the sound sharp and official in a way my earlier knocks had not been. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard movement inside. Footsteps. And the faint sound of a security chain being pulled tight. The door opened slightly again, just as it had that morning, with Clara's face appearing through the narrow gap. But the moment she noticed the uniform standing beside me, the calm expression she had worn earlier disappeared instantly. Confusion flashed across her face first, then something closer to concern. "Yes?" she asked cautiously. The officer stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. Ma'am, we received a report that the legal homeowner of this property has been denied access. Clara's eyes moved from the officer to me and back again. For the first time that day, she looked uncertain. She doesn't live here anymore, Clara said quickly. The officer didn't react to the statement at all. Instead, he spoke the next sentence slowly and clearly. According to the property records, Mrs. Carter is the sole legal owner of this house. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for several seconds. Clara blinked once, then twice, because in that moment, the plan she believed had already succeeded began to unravel. For several seconds, Clara didn't say anything. She simply stared at the officer as if trying to process what he had just told her. I could almost see the calculations moving through her mind, the sudden realization that the situation she thought was settled that morning had just shifted in a direction she hadn't anticipated. Behind the door, I could hear movement again inside the house. The faint sound of someone stepping closer. Daniel. The officer waited patiently. He had clearly dealt with situations like this before, and his calm posture made it obvious that he wasn't interested in arguments. He was interested in resolving a legal matter. Finally, Clara cleared her throat and tried to regain control of the conversation. She said she was leaving, Clara replied quickly. She told us she didn't want to live here anymore. The officer didn't even look surprised. That may be something you believed, he said calmly, but legally that does not change ownership of the property. Clara hesitated again. The door remained held by the security chain, creating a barrier that now looked far less confident than it had earlier that morning. I noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly against the doorframe, as if she was holding onto something that was slowly slipping away. At that moment, Daniel finally stepped into view behind her. My son looked different than he had the last time I saw him. Not physically older, but somehow more tired. His eyes moved from the officer to me, and I could see the discomfort immediately. He hadn't expected this. Clara might have convinced him the lock change was a simple solution, something temporary, something that would force a conversation later. But Daniel had always underestimated how quickly small decisions can grow into larger consequences. Mom, he said quietly. It was the first word he had spoken to me that day. The officer glanced briefly between the three of us before continuing. Sir, he said to Daniel, your mother is the legal owner of this property. She has the right to enter her home. If the locks were changed while she was absent, they need to be opened immediately. Daniel looked at Clara, waiting for her reaction before saying anything else. That alone told me how the balance inside the house had shifted over the past few months. My son, who once made decisions confidently, was now searching Clara's face for direction. Clara shook her head slightly, her voice rising with frustration. This is ridiculous, she said. We live here now. The officer remained completely calm. You live here with her permission, he replied. That permission does not give you authority to deny her access. Those words hung heavily in the air. Permission. The same word Mr. Lawson had used earlier in his office. Daniel rubbed his forehead nervously, clearly realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond what he expected when Clara suggested changing the locks the night before. He stepped closer to the door and spoke quietly to her. Clara, maybe we should just open it. But Clara didn't move. Instead, she crossed her arms defensively. She left, Clara insisted. We thought she moved out. I watched my son's reaction carefully. Daniel knew that statement wasn't true. He knew I had left the house for one evening, not forever. And the moment he hesitated instead of confirming Clara's claim, the officer noticed it as well. Ma'am, the officer said firmly now, I'm going to ask you one more time to remove the chain and allow Mrs. Carter into her home. The tension on the porch thickened. A car passed slowly down the street behind us. A neighbor across the road had stepped outside to check his mailbox, clearly curious about the police car parked nearby. Situations like this have a way of attracting quiet attention, even when no one says a word. Clara looked around briefly, noticing the growing awareness from the neighborhood. For the first time, doubt appeared clearly in her expression. Because what had started as a private decision inside the house the night before was now unfolding publicly. And the longer she kept that door closed, the worse it would look. Daniel spoke again, this time more firmly. Clara, Open the door. She stared at him for a moment, clearly frustrated that he wasn't defending her position anymore. But something in Daniel's tone had changed. Perhaps the presence of the officer had reminded him of something important. The house had never belonged to him. Slowly, reluctantly, Clara reached for the chain. The metal slid across the lock with a sharp sound. The door opened wider. And for the first time since that morning, the entrance to my own home stood open again. But what Clara still didn't understand was that unlocking the door was only the beginning of what was about to happen next. The door swung open slowly, and for a moment none of us moved. I stood on the porch looking into the living room I had known for so many years, the same room where birthdays had been celebrated and quiet evenings had passed with nothing more than a lamp glowing beside the couch. Yet standing there now felt strangely unfamiliar, as if the house itself had been holding its breath since the moment I left that morning. The officer stepped slightly to the side, giving me space. "You can go in, ma'am," he said calmly. I nodded and crossed the threshold. The smell of the house was the same, a mixture of wood polish, coffee, and the faint scent of the lavender candles I used to light in the evenings. But something else had changed. Small things. Details that only someone who had lived there for years would notice immediately. The photograph that used to sit on the hallway table was gone. The blanket I kept folded neatly on the couch had been replaced with another one I didn't recognize. Clara had already begun rearranging my home. Daniel stood near the kitchen entrance, watching me carefully, clearly unsure of what to say. His hands rested awkwardly in his pockets, the way they used to when he was younger and knew he had made a mistake, but wasn't sure how to admit it. For a few seconds, we simply looked at each other. Then I spoke. "Daniel," I said quietly. "Why?" The single word carried years of history behind it. My son looked down at the floor before answering. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. Clara immediately stepped forward, her voice sharp with frustration. "We needed space," she insisted. "You were always here, always involved in everything." I turned toward her slowly. "This is my house," I replied calmly. She opened her mouth as if preparing another argument, but the officer, who had quietly stepped inside behind us, raised his hand slightly. "Let's keep things calm," he said. "This situation is already resolved in terms of access." His presence in the room reminded everyone of the simple reality that had just been established. I was not the guest. I was the owner. Clara looked around the room, clearly realizing the control she believed she had that morning was slipping away quickly. But instead of stepping back, she crossed her arms again. "We've been living here for months," she said. "We pay for groceries, we help with bills." "That doesn't transfer ownership," the officer replied gently. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but necessary. Daniel walked toward the kitchen table and pulled out a chair, sitting down slowly as if the weight of the situation had finally caught up with him. His eyes moved between Clara and me, and I could see the conflict clearly written across his face. "Mom," he said quietly, "we thought maybe it was time for you to move somewhere smaller." I studied him carefully. "So, you decided to force that decision for me?" I asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Clara stepped forward again, her voice rising slightly. "She deserves peace," Clara said. "And we deserve a place where we can build our life." Those words would have sounded reasonable if the foundation beneath them hadn't been so flawed. "You can build your life anywhere," I replied calmly, "just not by taking someone else's." The officer glanced at his watch before speaking again. "My job here is to ensure Mrs. Carter can access her property," he said. "That part is now complete." He paused for a moment before continuing. "But I would strongly suggest the three of you discuss living arrangements moving forward." That sentence shifted the entire atmosphere inside the room. Clara's expression changed instantly, because now she understood something important. Opening the door had restored my access, but it had also reopened the real question she had hoped to avoid. Who would actually be living in the house now? Daniel rubbed his hands together nervously, while Clara stood frozen near the doorway. Neither of them had expected the situation to unfold this way. In their minds, the lock change had been the final step, but it was only the beginning. The officer turned toward me. "Ma'am, if you need anything further, You can contact the department, he said politely. Thank you, I replied. He nodded once and walked toward the door, leaving the three of us standing in the living room. For a moment the house was completely silent. Then Clara spoke again, her voice quieter now but still tense. So, what happens now? I looked around the room slowly, taking in every detail of the place that had once been peaceful and was now filled with tension. What Clara didn't realize yet was that the real conversation had not even started, and the next decision I was about to make would change everything inside that house. For several seconds after the officer left, no one spoke. The sound of the front door closing behind him echoed through the hallway, and suddenly the house felt smaller than it had ever felt before. Not physically smaller, but heavier, as if every wall had absorbed the tension that had built throughout the day. Daniel sat at the kitchen table staring down at his hands, while Clara stood near the living room doorway watching me carefully, waiting to see what I would do next. I walked slowly toward the center of the living room and placed my purse on the table where it had rested countless times before. The simple action felt almost ceremonial, like reclaiming something that had been quietly taken away earlier that morning. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock above the fireplace. Clara broke the silence first. You can't expect us to just leave, she said. Her tone was no longer confident. The sharp certainty she had shown earlier had faded, replaced by something closer to defensive urgency. I turned toward her calmly. I didn't ask you to leave, I said. Daniel looked up immediately, surprised by the answer. Clara blinked, as if she had misheard me. You didn't, she asked. No, I replied. The tension in the room shifted slightly. Both of them had expected anger, a demand, perhaps even an ultimatum. But the truth was, I had already spent the entire morning thinking carefully about what mattered most. And emotional reactions rarely produce good outcomes. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Mom, what are you saying? I walked toward the kitchen table and pulled out a chair across from him, sitting down slowly. From this angle, I could see the same window that had once looked out over the backyard where Daniel used to play when he was a child. The memories of that place were still alive in every corner of the house. I'm saying, I answered quietly, that I never planned to throw my son out of my home. Clara's expression softened slightly, as if relief had begun forming in her mind. But relief arrived too early. However, I continued, that doesn't mean things will continue the way they were. Daniel looked at Clara briefly before turning his attention to me. What do you mean? He asked. I folded my hands calmly on the table. It means we need to talk about honesty. The word honesty carried weight in the room. Clara shifted her posture slightly. What honesty? She asked defensively. The honesty about what happened last night, I said. Neither of them spoke immediately. You didn't just change the locks, I continued. You planned it. Daniel lowered his eyes again. Clara said it would force a conversation, he murmured. Clara looked irritated by the way he had phrased that. It was the only way to make things move forward, she said. You were never going to leave otherwise. I studied her carefully. That sentence revealed far more than she probably intended. You thought I would disappear quietly, I said. Clara didn't respond, because the truth was obvious. The lock had been a strategy, a way to create pressure, a way to shift control without direct confrontation. But strategies built on false assumptions rarely succeed. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before. Mom, we just wanted our own space. I nodded slowly. And you will have it, I replied. Both of them looked confused again. Just not here forever. The words settled into the room slowly. Clara's relief disappeared instantly. What do you mean, not forever? She asked. I stood up from the table and walked toward the hallway, glancing briefly at the family photos still hanging along the wall. Each frame captured a moment from a life that had once felt simple and certain. When I turned back toward them, my voice remained calm. I mean that this house was never meant to become your permanent home. Daniel frowned slightly. But you told us we could stay while we saved money. That's correct, I replied. Clara crossed her arms again. So, what's the problem? I looked at her carefully before answering. The problem, I said quietly, is that saving money was supposed to involve respect. Silence returned to the house. Daniel shifted in his chair, clearly understanding the weight of that statement. Because respect had been the one condition that never needed to be written down. Clara opened her mouth again, preparing another argument. But before she could speak, I added one more sentence. And after what happened today, things will need to change. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of change? I paused for a moment, because the next decision I was about to explain was the one that would truly determine the future of everyone living in that house. And neither of them were prepared for what I was about to say. I remained standing in the hallway for a moment before speaking again. The quiet inside the house had changed. It was no longer the tense silence that comes after an argument, but the kind that appears when people realize something important is about to be decided. Daniel watched me carefully from the kitchen table, while Clara remained near the living room, her posture stiff, as if she was preparing herself for a confrontation. But I had no intention of shouting. Raising your voice rarely gives your words more power. It only gives the other person something to fight against. I'm going to give you both time, I said calmly. Daniel frowned slightly. Time for what? Time to find your own place. The words landed quietly, but their meaning spread quickly through the room. Clara reacted immediately. So now you're kicking us out? Her voice carried the frustration she had been holding back all afternoon. But I shook my head slowly. No, I replied. I'm correcting a mistake. Daniel leaned forward, confusion still written across his face. What mistake? The mistake of letting generosity turn into entitlement. Clara's eyes hardened at that word. We never asked you for charity, she snapped. I looked at her calmly.
You didn't need to ask.
I offered. Daniel rubbed his temples nervously, clearly wishing the conversation would slow down before it turned into something worse. Mom, how long? He asked quietly. I appreciated that question more than any argument Clara had made. Because Daniel, at least in that moment, was trying to understand the situation instead of fighting it. 3 months, I answered. Clara laughed bitterly. 3 months, she repeated. You expect us to find a house in 3 months? You won't need to buy a house, I said. You only need to rent one. Daniel remained quiet, calculating the reality of what I had just said. 3 months was not unreasonable. In fact, it was generous considering the way the morning had begun. But Clara wasn't thinking about reason. She was thinking about control. And what happens if we don't leave? She asked sharply. The question hung in the air for several seconds. I stepped a little closer to the kitchen table before answering. Then we'll have a different conversation. Daniel looked up quickly. What kind of conversation? The kind that happens with lawyers. The room became very quiet again. Clara stared at me, clearly realizing that the calm tone I had used all afternoon was not weakness. It was simply the voice of someone who had already thought through every step of the situation. Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly, absorbing the reality of the decision. 3 months. 90 days. That was the new timeline. For the first time since the police officer had left, Clara didn't immediately respond. Her mind was clearly moving through the implications of what had just been said. The house she believed she had secured that morning was no longer something she could control. It was a temporary arrangement. And temporary arrangements eventually end. Daniel finally spoke again. Mom, I'm sorry about what happened today. The sincerity in his voice caught Clara's attention immediately. She turned toward him sharply, clearly irritated that he was apologizing instead of defending their position. But Daniel didn't look at her. He looked at me. I should have talked to you first, he continued quietly. I nodded slightly. Yes, I said. You should have. Clara finally stepped forward again, her voice tense. So that's it, she said. You just decided everything for us? I turned toward her calmly. No, I replied. You decided something this morning. Her eyes narrowed. What do you mean? You decided to change the locks on someone else's house. The sentence carried no anger, only facts. Clara opened her mouth again, but nothing came out this time. Because deep down she understood something that had become painfully clear throughout the afternoon. The situation had never been about power. It had been about ownership. And ownership had already been settled long before she touched that lock. Daniel slowly stood up from the table. I'll start looking for places tomorrow, he said quietly. Clara looked at him in disbelief. You're serious? Daniel nodded. Yes. For a moment Clara looked as if she might argue again. But something in Daniel's expression had changed. The uncertainty that had followed him earlier was gone. Perhaps the events of the afternoon had reminded him of something he had forgotten. The house was never his to control. I walked toward the living room and picked up the blanket Clara had placed on the couch earlier. It wasn't mine, but I folded it neatly anyway and placed it back where it had been. The house was still mine. And now, for the first time that day, the atmosphere inside it felt stable again. But what none of us realized yet was that the next few weeks would reveal something far deeper than a conflict about a house. Because sometimes situations like this expose truths that had been hiding quietly inside a family for years. The rest of that evening passed in an unusual kind of quiet. No one raised their voice again, but the air inside the house felt different than it had that morning. When a truth finally becomes clear, arguments often lose their purpose. Daniel spent most of the evening sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, occasionally searching for apartments in nearby neighborhoods. Clara moved around the house with a tense energy, opening cabinets, closing drawers, pacing between rooms as if trying to decide what to say next. I remained mostly in the living room, sitting in the same chair where I used to read in the evenings. From there I could see the hallway and part of the kitchen, and for the first time in months, I simply observed the dynamic between the two of them without stepping in or trying to smooth things over. It was a strange realization. For a long time, I had believed the tension in the house came from generational differences. I thought perhaps Clara simply needed time to adjust to living with someone older, someone who had already built a life before she arrived. But watching the way she spoke to Daniel that evening made something much clearer. The problem was never space. The problem was control. At one point, Daniel stood up from the table and walked toward the living room, rubbing the back of his neck the way he often did when he was stressed. He sat down across from me quietly. I didn't think things would turn out like this, he said. I studied him carefully before answering. Most people don't, I replied. He looked down at the floor. Clara said you were unhappy living with us, he continued. That sentence caught my attention. Did she? I asked calmly. Daniel nodded slowly. She said you were tired of the house, that you wanted something smaller. I leaned back in the chair, letting the information settle in my mind. That explained several small conversations from the past few months. Clara had been planting ideas, shaping Daniel's understanding of the situation little by little. She never told you that, Daniel added quietly. No, I said. He sighed. I should have asked you directly. Yes, I replied again. Daniel remained silent for a few moments before speaking again. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Were you really planning to live here forever? The question wasn't hostile. It sounded more like genuine curiosity. I looked around the living room slowly, taking in the familiar furniture, the photographs on the walls, the small details that had shaped my life for so many years. No, I answered honestly. Daniel looked surprised. You weren't. I shook my head. Eventually, I planned to move somewhere smaller, I said. But that decision was supposed to be mine. He nodded slowly, understanding the difference. Clara suddenly appeared in the hallway, her expression still tense.
So you admit it, she said.
Daniel turned toward her. Admit what? That she was planning to leave anyway. I remained calm. Eventually, I repeated. Clara crossed her arms. Then what's the big problem? Daniel looked at her with visible frustration. The problem, he said, is how it happened. Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, clearly trying to maintain control of the conversation. You're overreacting, she said after a moment. We were just trying to move things forward. Daniel shook his head. No, he said quietly. You changed the locks on my mother's house. The way he said it made the situation sound exactly as serious as it actually was. Clara set the glass down harder than necessary. Well, it worked, she replied. The sentence lingered in the air uncomfortably. Daniel looked stunned. Worked, he repeated. Yes, Clara said. Now everything is finally moving. For the first time that evening, I saw something shift in my son's expression. Clara believed the events of the day had been successful. But Daniel was beginning to realize something else. The lock might have forced a conversation, but it had also revealed something about the person he married that he had never fully seen before. He looked at her for several seconds before speaking again. "You planned this," he said quietly. Clara didn't answer. And sometimes silence is the clearest answer of all. Daniel slowly stood up from the couch and walked back toward the kitchen table. This time, when he opened his laptop again, his focus looked different. He wasn't just searching for apartments anymore. He was thinking, really thinking. And Clara still didn't realize that the door she had opened that morning had also opened Daniel's eyes. That night the house felt unusually quiet, even after everyone went to their rooms. I stayed in the living room longer than usual, listening to the soft sounds that every home carries after dark. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the faint creak of the floorboards settling. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street before the neighborhood returned to silence. But the quiet inside my mind was different. The events of the day had revealed more than I expected. For months, I had believed the tension inside the house was simply the result of people trying to adjust to living together. But what I had seen in Clara's behavior that afternoon suggested something deeper. She had not acted impulsively when she changed the locks. That kind of decision required planning. It required confidence. And confidence usually comes from believing you understand exactly how someone else will react. Clara had believed I would panic. She had believed I would argue. She had believed I would eventually leave quietly. But she had misjudged one important detail. Patience often looks like weakness to people who only understand confrontation. Sometime after midnight, I finally went upstairs to my bedroom. The room looked exactly as I had left it the night before, yet stepping inside felt strangely emotional. For a few seconds, I simply stood there looking at the familiar furniture, the photographs on the dresser, the curtains I had chosen years earlier, when the house still felt full of life and possibility. The house had survived many difficult moments over the years, and this one would pass too. I slept lightly that night, waking several times as thoughts continued moving through my mind. Around 3 a.m, I heard quiet footsteps in the hallway outside my room. A moment later, someone knocked softly on the door. "Mom," it was Daniel. "Come in," I said. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside, closing it behind him. The hallway light cast a faint glow into the room, outlining his tired expression. He looked like he hadn't slept either. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded and sat up in bed while he pulled a chair closer to the dresser. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Daniel stared at the floor the way he used to when he was younger, and trying to figure out how to admit a mistake. "Clara didn't tell me she was changing the locks," he said finally. I listened quietly. "She mentioned it earlier in the evening," he continued. "But I thought she was just frustrated. I didn't think she would actually do it." His voice carried genuine regret. "You still allowed it to happen?" I replied gently. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes." He ran a hand through his hair before continuing. "She said if we didn't do something soon, we would never have our own life." I looked at him carefully. "And you believed that?" "I didn't know what to believe," he admitted. Daniel had always been thoughtful, sometimes too thoughtful for his own good. People like that often become vulnerable to stronger personalities who present decisions as urgent problems. Clara had understood that. "Daniel," I said quietly, "do you remember when you were 16 and wanted to buy that old motorcycle from your friend?" A faint smile appeared on his face. "You told me to wait 6 months," he said. "And what happened?" "The motorcycle broke down before I bought it." I nodded. Time reveals many things. Daniel leaned back in the chair, thinking. "You think this is the same kind of situation?" he asked. "I think time has already started revealing things." He remained silent for a moment before asking another question. "Do you hate Clara now?" The question surprised me slightly. "No," I answered honestly. Daniel looked relieved, but also confused. "Then why does everything feel so broken?" I thought carefully before answering. "Because respect was broken," I said. "And respect takes time to rebuild." Daniel stared at the floor again. "Clara says you never liked her," he said quietly. "That isn't true." He looked up. "It isn't." "No," I replied. "But I always noticed something about her." "What?" I paused for a moment. She tries to control situations before she understands them. Daniel considered that statement carefully. Like today. Yes. The room grew quiet again. Daniel stood up slowly and walked toward the door before stopping. Mom, if we leave in 3 months, he said, do you think things between us can go back to normal? I looked at my son and answered honestly. That depends on what you learned during those 3 months. He nodded slowly and left the room, closing the door behind him. As the hallway light faded, I lay back down and stared at the ceiling. Because deep down I knew something Daniel hadn't realized yet. The next 3 months would not only decide where they lived, they would decide the future of Daniel's marriage as well. And Clara still believed that the real conflict had already passed. She had no idea that the most difficult part of the story hadn't even begun yet. The next morning the house woke slowly, as if everyone inside it understood that the balance of things had changed. Sunlight crept through the kitchen windows, casting long golden lines across the table where Daniel had spent most of the previous evening searching for apartments. I woke earlier than usual, partly out of habit and partly because my mind had already accepted that the next few months would require patience. When I walked downstairs, the house was quiet. The coffee maker sat exactly where it always had, and for a moment I enjoyed the simple comfort of preparing coffee in my own kitchen again. Small routines have a way of grounding people after difficult days. A few minutes later I heard footsteps behind me. Daniel entered the kitchen wearing the same thoughtful expression he had carried since the night before. He greeted me quietly and poured himself a cup of coffee before sitting down at the table. I found a few apartments online, he said. I nodded slightly. That's a good start. He turned his laptop toward me, so I could see the listings. Most of them were small places across town. Nothing luxurious, but perfectly reasonable for a couple beginning their lives together. Rent isn't as bad as I expected, he said. That's because you were comparing it to owning a house, I replied gently. Daniel gave a small smile at that. For a moment the atmosphere in the kitchen felt almost normal again. Not completely comfortable, but calmer than it had been the day before. Then Clara walked in. Her presence immediately changed the energy in the room. She moved directly to the refrigerator without greeting either of us and pulled out a bottle of water. Her expression remained guarded, as if she had spent the night preparing arguments she was still deciding whether to use. So, she said after a moment, we're just pretending yesterday didn't happen? Daniel looked up from the laptop. No one said that. Clara leaned against the counter, watching both of us carefully. Because it feels like everyone suddenly expects me to apologize, she continued. I stirred my coffee quietly. No one asked for that either. Clara frowned slightly, clearly unsure how to respond to calm answers. Daniel finally spoke. Clara, changing the locks wasn't the right way to handle things. She immediately turned toward him. And what would you have done? She asked. Wait another year? Daniel hesitated. Maybe talk first. Clara shook her head. Talking wasn't working. Her voice carried the same certainty she had shown the previous day. And that certainty revealed something important. Clara still believed the lock had been the right decision. Daniel leaned back in his chair slowly. You didn't even tell me you were going to do it, he said. Clara crossed her arms. I told you we needed to do something. That's not the same thing. The tension in the room began rising again. I placed my coffee cup down gently before speaking. This conversation isn't about yesterday anymore. Both of them looked at me. It's about the next 3 months. Clara exhaled sharply. You keep saying that like everything is already decided. It is, I replied calmly. Daniel closed his laptop slowly. What exactly do you expect from us during those 3 months? He asked. I appreciated the directness of the question. Respect, I answered. Clara laughed under her breath. That's vague. No, I said. It's actually very simple. Daniel watched me carefully. What does that mean? It means we live peacefully in the same house until you're ready to move, I explained. No manipulation. No pressure. No attempts to control what isn't yours. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly at the last sentence. You're still angry. No, I replied quietly. Then why keep bringing it up? Because the truth shouldn't be ignored. Daniel looked between us, clearly realizing that this conversation was no longer about living arrangements. It was about character. For the first time that morning, Clara looked uncertain again. Perhaps she was beginning to understand that the situation had shifted in a way she could no longer easily control. But what she still didn't realize was that the biggest shift wasn't happening in the house. It was happening inside Daniel. Because once a person begins to see someone clearly, it becomes very difficult to unsee what they've learned. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house settled into an uneasy routine. No one argued openly, but the tension still existed beneath the surface, like a quiet current running through calm water. Daniel spent most of his evenings searching for apartments, occasionally visiting a few places after work. Clara followed along at first, but it became clear very quickly that she was far less enthusiastic about the idea of moving than Daniel was. I noticed it in the small things. Every time Daniel mentioned a new apartment listing, Clara would find a reason why it wasn't good enough. The neighborhood wasn't right. The kitchen was too small. The rent was too high. The building looked old. At first those concerns sounded reasonable, but after several days the pattern became impossible to ignore. Nothing was ever acceptable. One evening Daniel returned home carrying a folder with several printed apartment listings. I was sitting in the living room reading when he walked in and dropped the papers onto the coffee table. "I think I found a good one," he said. His voice carried a hint of optimism I hadn't heard in days. Clara walked into the room a moment later, glancing at the papers. "Where?" she asked. "Maple Street," Daniel replied. 2 bedrooms, decent price, only 15 minutes from my job. Clara picked up the listing and scanned it quickly before shaking her head. "That area isn't safe." Daniel frowned slightly. "I checked the crime statistics. It's fine." Clara placed the paper back on the table. "It still feels wrong." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Clara, we can't reject every option." She crossed her arms. "I'm not living somewhere that feels temporary." Daniel looked confused. "Renting is temporary." "That's exactly the problem," she replied. For a moment the room fell silent. I watched the conversation quietly, noticing how Daniel's patience was beginning to wear thin. "You wanted space," he said. "Yes." "And now we're trying to find a place." "Yes." "Then what's the issue?" Clara hesitated. "The issue," she said slowly, "is that moving backwards doesn't make sense." Daniel looked at her carefully. "What do you mean backwards?" Clara glanced around the living room. "This house is bigger than anything we'll rent." The meaning of her statement became clear immediately. She wasn't thinking about temporary solutions. She was thinking about staying. Daniel seemed to realize the same thing. "Clara," he said quietly, "we already talked about this." She shrugged. "Situations change." Daniel stared at her. "Nothing has changed." Clara looked directly at him. "Yes, it has." The tension in the room grew thicker. Daniel leaned forward. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Clara hesitated for a moment before answering. "Maybe we rushed into the whole moving idea." Daniel blinked in disbelief. "You're serious?" "I'm just saying we should think carefully before making a decision that affects our future." Daniel stood up from the couch slowly. "Our future," he repeated. Clara nodded. "Yes." Daniel looked toward the hallway for a moment before turning back to her. "You tried to force my mother out of her house." Clara's voice hardened slightly. "That was a strategy." Daniel stared at her in silence for several seconds. A strategy. Hearing her say those words out loud seemed to change something inside him. "Do you hear yourself?" he asked quietly. Clara didn't respond. Daniel walked toward the kitchen window and stood there looking outside for a moment before speaking again. "I thought you were frustrated," he said. "I thought you just wanted things to move forward." Clara remained still. "But you actually believed that would work."
She didn't deny it.
And sometimes the absence of denial says everything. Daniel turned around slowly. "You thought if you pushed hard enough, she would give up the house." Clara finally spoke again. She was going to leave eventually. Daniel shook his head. "That's not the same thing." The room became very quiet, because now the real issue had finally surfaced. Clara wasn't just reacting to frustration. She had been planning something. And Daniel was only now beginning to understand how far those plans had gone. I remained seated in the chair, watching the conversation unfold without interrupting. Because this was no longer my argument. This was the moment Daniel needed to see clearly. Clara looked at him carefully. "You're overthinking everything." Daniel let out a slow breath. "No," he said quietly. "For the first time, I think I'm finally thinking clearly." And the way he said it made something very obvious. The lock that had been placed on the door days earlier had unlocked something far more important inside Daniel's mind. The days that followed began revealing a side of Clara that Daniel had never fully confronted before. Living together under the same roof, while preparing to move, created a strange environment. Conversations that once would have been avoided were now impossible to ignore. Every dinner, every quiet evening in the living room, every discussion about apartments slowly peeled back another layer of the tension that had been hiding beneath the surface for months. Daniel continued visiting apartments after work, often returning with photos or notes about places he had seen. Each time he tried to discuss them with Clara, the same pattern repeated itself. She would listen briefly, then dismiss the option with a new reason. Sometimes the neighborhood felt wrong. Sometimes the building looked outdated. Other times, she simply said the place didn't feel right for their future. One evening, Daniel returned home later than usual. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door open, followed by the familiar sound of his keys being placed on the hallway table. When he entered the kitchen, his expression looked tired but determined. "I signed an application for one," he said. I set my cup down slowly. "That was quick." "It's a good place," he replied. 2 bedrooms, quiet area, fair price. Clara walked into the kitchen a moment later and immediately sensed something had changed. "What application?" she asked. Daniel turned toward her calmly. "For the apartment on Pine Avenue." Clara's reaction was immediate. "You applied without talking to me first?" Daniel frowned slightly. "We did talk about it." "No," she said sharply. "You mentioned it once." Daniel leaned against the counter. "Clara, we've discussed dozens of apartments. None of them were right. This one is." Clara shook her head firmly. "I'm not moving there." The statement hung in the air. Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "You don't get to refuse every option," he said. Clara crossed her arms again, the defensive posture she seemed to adopt whenever things didn't go her way. "I'm thinking about our future," she insisted. Daniel studied her expression carefully. "Our future doesn't involve staying here." Clara hesitated. "You don't know that." Daniel's voice remained calm, but firmer now. "Yes, I do." She looked frustrated. "You're choosing her side." The sentence landed heavily in the room. Daniel's reaction came slowly. "This isn't about sides," he replied. Clara pointed toward the living room where I had been sitting earlier. "It clearly is." Daniel shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "It's about reality." Clara's voice rose slightly. "The reality is she was going to leave eventually." Daniel's patience finally began to crack. "That doesn't give us the right to push her out." Clara rolled her eyes. "You're making this bigger than it is." Daniel stared at her for a moment before asking something unexpected. "Clara, when you changed the locks, what did you think would happen next?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked away toward the hallway, as if trying to avoid the question. Daniel repeated it. "What did you expect?" Clara finally sighed. "I thought she'd stay with friends or find a smaller place." Daniel nodded slowly. "So, you expected her to leave?" Clara shrugged. "Yes." Daniel ran a hand through his hair again, clearly struggling with the realization that the situation had not been impulsive at all. It had been planned. "You never intended to move," he said quietly.
Clara didn't respond.
But the silence was enough. Daniel stepped back from the counter, shaking his head slightly as the truth settled in. "You weren't trying to move forward," he said. "You were trying to take over." Clara's eyes flashed with irritation. "That's not fair." Daniel laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "No," he replied. "What's not fair is realizing I married someone who thought this was acceptable." The room fell silent again, because those words had crossed a line neither of them had crossed before. For the first time since the entire situation began, Clara looked genuinely uncertain. And Daniel looked like a man who was finally seeing the full picture of the life he had built. But what Clara still didn't understand was that Daniel wasn't just questioning the house anymore. He was beginning to question everything. That night the house felt heavier than it had at any point since the situation began. The conversation in the kitchen had ended without resolution, but the words Daniel had spoken lingered in the air long after everyone left the room. Sometimes a single sentence reveals more truth than weeks of arguments, and Clara seemed to understand that something important had shifted. Daniel spent the evening in the living room scrolling through apartment listings again, though this time his focus appeared deeper. He wasn't just searching for a place to live anymore. He was thinking about the larger picture of his life, and that kind of thinking tends to open doors that people didn't realize were closed. Clara stayed mostly upstairs. When she finally came down later that evening, her tone had changed completely. The sharp confidence she had carried earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter and more strategic. "Daniel," she said gently, "can we talk?" Daniel looked up from the laptop but didn't close it. "We've been talking all day." "I mean really talk," she replied. He sighed softly and leaned back on the couch. "All right." Clara sat down across from him, her posture calmer than usual. "I think everything today got out of control," she began. Daniel didn't respond immediately. "What part of it?" he asked. "The argument," she said. "The tension." Daniel watched her carefully. "The tension didn't start today." Clara nodded, as if acknowledging that point. "Maybe not," she admitted, "but we're letting it get between us." Daniel remained quiet. "You're upset with me," she continued. "Yes. But we're supposed to be building a life together." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "That life doesn't start by pushing someone else out of theirs." Clara looked down at her hands briefly before speaking again. "I didn't think it would turn into this." Daniel studied her expression. "You didn't think the police would show up?" Clara hesitated. "No." The honesty in that answer was at least real. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Clara, what were you really trying to do?" She looked up at him. "I was trying to create stability for us." Daniel shook his head. "That wasn't stability." Clara's voice softened further. "I just wanted us to have our own place." Daniel gestured around the room. "This was never our place." The sentence seemed to settle into Clara's mind in a way the earlier conversations had not. She looked around the living room slowly. "I thought eventually it would be," she admitted quietly. Daniel stared at her. "That's the problem." Clara's eyes met his. "You're saying you never wanted that?" Daniel didn't hesitate.
No.
The certainty in his voice surprised her. "You're serious?" "Yes." Clara looked genuinely confused now. "But you said living here would help us save money." "It did." "Then why wouldn't you want to stay?" Daniel leaned back in the couch and answered calmly. "Because it was never meant to be permanent." Clara remained silent. For the first time since the entire situation began, she seemed to be confronting the reality that Daniel's understanding of the arrangement had always been different from hers. She had been planning for ownership. Daniel had been planning for independence. Those two visions were never the same. Clara tried once more. "Daniel, we could still make this work." He looked at her carefully. "Work how?" "We stay here until your mother decides to leave." Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "You still don't understand." Clara frowned. "Understand what?" Daniel spoke slowly now. "That this house isn't something we're waiting to inherit." The sentence carried a weight Clara had not expected. She opened her mouth to respond, but Daniel continued. "My mother built her life here," he said. "It's not a prize waiting at the end of someone else's patience." Clara didn't answer, because deep down she knew something had changed. Daniel was no longer simply reacting to the situation. He was drawing boundaries. And boundaries are very difficult to move once they are clearly established. The living room fell quiet again. For a moment Clara seemed to be considering her next words carefully. But Daniel had already reached a point where the direction of his thinking had shifted permanently. And what Clara still didn't realize was that Daniel wasn't just preparing to move out of the house. He was preparing to move away from the person he believed he had married. The following week unfolded with a quiet intensity that none of us had expected. Daniel continued moving forward with the apartment application on Pine Avenue, and by the middle of the week he received confirmation that the lease had been approved. When he walked into the house that evening holding the paperwork, the atmosphere shifted instantly. I was sitting at the dining table reading when he entered. It's done, he said. I looked up. You got it? He nodded. Lease starts next month. For a moment, there was a sense of relief in his voice, the kind that comes when a difficult decision finally becomes concrete. But that relief didn't last long. Clara came down the stairs a few seconds later and immediately noticed the papers in his hands. What's that? She asked. Daniel answered calmly. The apartment lease. Clara froze. You signed it? Yes. Her expression hardened immediately. You didn't wait for me. Daniel looked at her carefully. We've been discussing this for days. Clara shook her head. That wasn't a real discussion. Daniel sighed quietly. Clara, we needed to move forward. Clara stepped closer, her voice rising slightly. No, you decided to move forward. Daniel placed the paperwork on the table. Yes. The directness of the answer surprised her. You're just making decisions without me now? Daniel leaned against the chair. I've been trying to make decisions with you. Clara crossed her arms again. And when I disagree, you ignore me. Daniel shook his head slowly. When you disagree with every possible solution, something still has to happen. Clara stared at him. I'm not moving there. The room went quiet. Daniel seemed prepared for that response. You'll need to decide what you want to do, he said. Clara blinked in disbelief. What does that mean? It means the lease starts next month. Clara's voice sharpened. And you expect me to just follow you? Daniel answered calmly. I expect us to move forward with our life. Clara laughed bitterly. That tiny apartment is your idea of a life? Daniel looked at her steadily. It's a start. Clara shook her head again.
No.
Daniel waited. No, he repeated. I'm not leaving this house. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. That's not your decision. Clara gestured toward the hallway. She said, 3 months. Daniel nodded. Yes. Well then, Clara replied, we still have time. Daniel stared at her carefully. Time for what? Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the house slowly, the same way she had done several times before. Then she said something that made the entire room feel suddenly colder. People change their minds. Daniel's expression shifted.
About what?
Clara looked directly at him. About houses. The meaning behind her words became very clear. Daniel's voice grew firmer. She's not selling. Clara shrugged. You don't know that. Daniel stepped forward slightly. Yes, I do. Clara held his gaze. You're very confident. Daniel paused before replying. Because I know my mother. Clara gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. You think you do. For several seconds the room fell silent again. Then Daniel said something that clearly surprised her. Clara, are you waiting for her to leave? She didn't answer, but her silence confirmed everything. Daniel let out a long breath and looked down at the lease papers on the table. I thought you wanted a home with me, he said quietly. Clara replied without hesitation. I want the best home we can have. Daniel nodded slowly. And if that means taking someone else's? Clara didn't respond. Daniel picked up the lease and folded it carefully. The apartment is ready in 4 weeks, he said. Clara's voice turned cold. You're really doing this? Daniel looked directly at her. Yes. The certainty in his voice was different now. It wasn't just determination. It was clarity. For the first time since the entire situation began, Daniel seemed completely certain about the direction he was going. And Clara was beginning to realize something she had never expected. The plan she had started with a simple lock had not brought Daniel closer to her. It had pushed him further away. But what none of us realized yet was that the next discovery Daniel would make would change the entire story of his marriage. The following days passed with an uneasy calm, but something subtle had shifted in Daniel's behavior. He was quieter now, more observant. Instead of arguing with Clara when she dismissed the apartment or questioned his decisions, he simply listened. At first, Clara interpreted that silence as uncertainty, believing that if she pushed hard enough he might reconsider the move. But the truth was very different. Daniel wasn't hesitating. He was paying attention. When people finally begin to see clearly, they stop arguing and start observing. And over the next several days, Daniel began noticing things he had overlooked for months. Small things. One evening he returned home earlier than usual. His office had closed early due to a maintenance issue, and he decided to stop by the house before visiting the apartment complex again. When he opened the front door, the house was quiet. Clara's car was still in the driveway, which meant she was somewhere inside. He walked into the living room and placed his keys on the table. "Clara," he called. No answer. He checked the kitchen. Empty. The bedroom upstairs was also empty, but her purse was still on the dresser, which meant she hadn't gone far. As Daniel walked back toward the hallway, he heard her voice faintly coming from the back porch. She was on the phone. Daniel wasn't trying to listen at first, but as he stepped closer to the sliding door, something in her tone caught his attention. "Yes, I know," Clara was saying quietly, "but it's only temporary." Daniel paused. He hadn't heard Clara speak with that particular tone before. It was calm, confident, almost calculating. "No, Daniel doesn't know," she continued. Daniel felt a strange tightening in his chest. He stayed where he was, close enough to hear the conversation, but still inside the house. "I told you," Clara said into the phone. "We just need more time." A pause. Daniel couldn't hear the other person speaking. "Yes, the house is still in her name," Clara continued. "But she's old. Eventually she'll want something smaller." Daniel's stomach tightened further. Another pause. "No, the lock thing didn't work the way I planned," Clara admitted. The words landed like cold water. Planned. Daniel remained completely still. "But it opened the conversation," Clara said. "That was the important part." Another pause. "She gave us 3 months," Clara continued. Daniel felt his pulse beginning to quicken. "Yes, 3 months," Clara repeated. "That's enough time." Another pause. "No," she said. Daniel is starting to question things. Daniel's breathing slowed as he focused carefully on every word. "But I can manage that," Clara added confidently. A pause followed. "Of course," she said. "Once the house becomes available, everything changes." Daniel felt the meaning of that sentence sink deeply into his mind. The house becomes available. Clara was not thinking about renting an apartment. She had been waiting for the house, waiting for the moment it might eventually belong to Daniel, waiting for the moment she believed they could claim it. Daniel stepped back slowly from the door, careful not to make any noise. His mind was racing now, replaying every conversation from the past several months. The arguments about space, the pressure to move forward, the lock on the door. All of it suddenly looked different, because Clara had never been trying to move out. She had been trying to move up. Daniel quietly walked back into the living room and sat down on the couch, staring at the floor while Clara continued speaking outside. For the first time since their marriage began, Daniel felt a deep and unsettling clarity forming in his mind. The woman he married had not been building a future with him. She had been building a strategy around him. A few minutes later, Clara finished the call and stepped back inside the house. She looked surprised to see Daniel sitting there. "Oh," she said. "You're home early." Daniel looked up at her calmly.
"Yeah."
Clara walked into the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, like nothing unusual had happened. Daniel watched her quietly. "Who are you talking to?" he asked. Clara didn't hesitate. "My sister." Daniel nodded slowly. For the first time in their entire relationship, he knew she was lying. And once a person hears the truth hiding behind a lie, everything changes. But Clara still believed she was in control of the situation. She had no idea that Daniel had just heard the most important part of her entire plan. Daniel didn't confront Clara that night. That was the first thing that changed. A few months earlier, he would have reacted immediately. He would have walked onto the porch, asked questions, demanded explanations. But the conversation he overheard had done something different inside his mind. It had slowed him down. Instead of reacting, he began watching. Observation reveals far more than arguments. Clara returned to the living room a few minutes after finishing her call, sitting beside him on the couch with the same calm expression she had used earlier. "You look tired," she said. "Long day," Daniel replied. She nodded and leaned back against the cushions, completely unaware that Daniel now understood far more than she realized. "Did you visit the apartment again?" she asked.
"No."
Clara looked relieved for a moment. "Maybe that's a good thing," she said. "You were rushing into it." Daniel studied her quietly. You think so? Yes, she replied confidently. Big decisions shouldn't be rushed. Daniel nodded slowly. That was exactly the kind of sentence that once would have reassured him. Clara had always been good with words that sounded thoughtful and reasonable. But now that he knew what she had said on the phone only minutes earlier, those same words sounded completely different. They sounded strategic. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Clara, can I ask you something? Of course. When we first talked about living here, what did you imagine would happen in the future? Clara shrugged lightly. I assumed we would eventually move somewhere better. Daniel watched her carefully. What kind of better? She gestured casually around the house. Something like this. Maybe even nicer. Daniel nodded slowly. And if we never bought something like this? Clara laughed softly. Then we would keep working toward it. Daniel remained silent for a few seconds before asking another question. Would you be happy renting forever? Clara frowned slightly. No one wants that. Daniel leaned back again. Some people don't mind it. Clara shook her head. People settle when they rent forever. Daniel noticed the certainty in her voice. And ownership matters more? Yes. Daniel nodded again. That matched perfectly with what he had overheard earlier. Ownership.
Control.
Waiting for the house to become available. Clara stood up and walked toward the kitchen, opening the refrigerator while continuing the conversation. Why are you asking all these questions? She said casually. Daniel looked toward her. Just thinking about the future. She pulled out a bottle of water. Well, she said, the future depends on smart decisions. Daniel watched her carefully. Like changing locks? Clara froze for a moment. Only for a second. Then she turned around slowly. I told you that was a mistake. Daniel nodded slightly. That's not what you said earlier. Clara frowned. What do you mean? Daniel held her gaze. Earlier you said it worked. Clara looked irritated. I meant it forced a conversation. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked one more question. And what happens if the house becomes available someday? Clara blinked. What do you mean? Daniel kept his voice calm. If my mother eventually decides to move somewhere else. Clara's expression shifted slightly. Well, that would change things. Daniel nodded.
How?
Clara hesitated for the first time. Well, that depends. On what? She shrugged. On whether she sells it. Daniel watched her carefully. Or gives it to me? Clara remained silent. Daniel let the silence stretch for several seconds before speaking again. Clara, if that happened, what would you want us to do? Clara looked around the living room slowly before answering. Why would we leave? Daniel felt the final piece of the puzzle fall into place. Everything Clara had said during the phone call now aligned perfectly with the way she spoke about the house. She had never been planning to move. She had been planning to stay. Daniel stood up slowly from the couch. I'm going for a walk, he said. Clara looked surprised. At this hour?
Yeah.
She studied his face carefully. Are you okay? Daniel gave a small nod. Just thinking. He grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door. Clara watched him leave, still believing she had successfully guided the conversation away from anything serious. But as Daniel stepped outside into the cool night air, one thought had already become crystal clear in his mind. The problem was never the house. The problem was the person who believed the house was the prize. And for the first time since the entire situation began, Daniel was beginning to understand exactly what kind of marriage he was actually living in. But the decision he was about to make next would shock Clara more than anything that had happened so far. Daniel walked slowly down the quiet street, the cool night air clearing his thoughts in a way the house could not. The neighborhood was silent except for the distant sound of a car passing somewhere far away. He had walked these same sidewalks countless times growing up, but tonight the familiarity felt different. Because his mind was finally connecting pieces that had never quite fit together before. For months, he had assumed the tension inside the house was simply the natural result of three adults trying to share space. He believed Clara was frustrated. He believed she wanted independence. But the conversation he overheard on the porch had revealed something much more deliberate. Clara had never been trying to move out. She had been trying to move up. Daniel stopped beneath the streetlight and stared down at the pavement, replaying the words he had heard earlier. Once the house becomes available, everything changes. The sentence echoed in his mind again and again. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the way Clara thought, the way she calculated outcomes, the way she spoke about people as obstacles instead of family. Daniel had always believed marriage meant building something together. But now he was beginning to realize that Clara had been building something different entirely. A strategy. And strategies rarely involve love. After several minutes, he turned around and began walking back toward the house. His mind felt strangely calm now, the way it does when a difficult truth finally settles into place. When he opened the front door, the living room lights were still on. Clara was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone. "You were gone a while," she said without looking up. Daniel closed the door quietly. "Needed some air." She glanced at him briefly. "You've been acting strange tonight." Daniel walked toward the center of the room and stopped. "I heard your phone call earlier." Clara froze. Slowly, she lowered the phone and looked at him. "What phone call?" Daniel didn't raise his voice. "The one on the porch." Clara stared at him silently for several seconds. Then she forced a small smile. "Oh, that." Daniel waited. "My sister," she said casually. Daniel shook his head.
No.
Clara's expression tightened slightly. "What do you mean no?" "I mean it wasn't your sister." Her voice sharpened. "You're accusing me of lying?" Daniel remained calm. "I heard the conversation." Clara stood up slowly. "And?" Daniel looked directly at her. "You said the lock was part of a plan." Clara didn't respond. "You said 3 months was enough time." Still silence. "And you said once the house becomes available, everything changes." The room became very quiet. Clara's eyes moved away from his. "That's not what I meant," she said finally. Daniel nodded slowly. "Then explain it." Clara crossed her arms defensively. "You're twisting things." Daniel let out a quiet breath. "No, I'm finally understanding them." Clara's tone grew sharper. "You're overreacting." Daniel studied her face carefully.
No.
She laughed nervously. "You're acting like I committed a crime." Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked one simple question. "Who were you talking to?" Clara hesitated. "That's none of your business." The answer told him everything. Daniel walked to the table and picked up the apartment lease. "I'm moving next month," he said. Clara blinked. "You already said that." Daniel looked at her again. "But now I'm not sure you're coming with me." The sentence landed like a shock. Clara's voice rose instantly. "What is that supposed to mean?" Daniel's expression remained steady. "It means I'm starting to question the life we're building." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "You're questioning our marriage because of a phone call?" Daniel shook his head slowly.
No.
He looked around the house briefly before continuing. "I'm questioning it because I'm finally seeing what you wanted all along." Clara's voice trembled with anger. "And what is that?" Daniel answered quietly. "The house." Clara laughed bitterly. "That's ridiculous." Daniel held her gaze. "Is it?" Clara didn't answer, because deep down she knew something had gone very wrong. The moment Daniel overheard that conversation, the entire strategy she had built around patience and pressure had collapsed. And for the first time since she married him, Clara realized she was no longer controlling the direction of the story. The silence after Daniel's words stretched longer than either of them expected. Clara stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her arms still crossed, but the confidence she usually carried was gone. For the first time since the entire situation began, she looked uncertain. "You're being dramatic," she finally said. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "I'm being honest." Clara laughed nervously, pacing once across the room before turning back toward him. "So what now?" she asked. "You're just going to throw away our marriage because you overheard part of a conversation?" Daniel remained calm. "It wasn't just the conversation." Clara rolled her eyes. "Then what?" Daniel gestured around the house. "Everything." She frowned. "That's vague." Daniel stepped closer, his voice still steady. "The arguments about space." Clara didn't respond. The pressure to move faster. Silence. The lock. Clara's jaw tightened. And the plan you thought I didn't understand. Clara exhaled sharply. You're making this sound like some conspiracy. Daniel shook his head again.
No.
He looked directly into her eyes. I'm making it sound like the truth. Clara looked away. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, she said something quieter than anything she had said all evening. You're really going to let this ruin everything? Daniel took a slow breath. That depends on you. Clara looked up again. What do you mean? Daniel placed the apartment lease back on the table carefully. It depends on whether you're honest. Clara hesitated. I've been honest. Daniel's expression didn't change.
No.
She opened her mouth to argue again, but Daniel interrupted. You weren't planning to move, he said. Clara stayed silent. You were waiting. Still silence. Daniel continued. You believed if you pushed hard enough, eventually the house would become ours. Clara's eyes filled with frustration. That's not what I said. Daniel's voice softened slightly. It's exactly what you said. The tension in the room reached its highest point. Clara walked toward the kitchen and leaned against the counter, staring at the floor as if searching for the right words. Finally, she spoke again. So, what if I did? She said quietly. Daniel blinked. What? Clara lifted her head. So, what if I thought that? She repeated. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. You planned this. Clara shrugged slightly. I was thinking about our future. Daniel felt a deep heaviness settle in his chest. Our future doesn't start by taking someone else's life, he said. Clara's voice rose again. You're acting like I tried to steal something. Daniel didn't hesitate. You did. The room fell silent once more. Clara looked stunned by the directness of the accusation. But Daniel had reached a point where avoiding the truth no longer felt possible. I thought we were building something together, he said quietly. Clara looked at him. We were. Daniel shook his head.
No.
He pointed gently toward the walls around them. You were waiting for something that wasn't yours. Clara didn't respond. Daniel picked up his jacket from the chair. I'm still moving next month, he said. Clara's voice cracked slightly. And us. Daniel paused. For a moment, the entire house seemed to hold its breath. Then he answered with complete honesty. I don't know. Clara's eyes widened. You're serious? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Clara stared at him as if she had just realized the full weight of what had happened. The lock she placed on the door weeks earlier had been meant to force control. Instead, it had forced clarity. And clarity can destroy illusions faster than any argument. Daniel walked toward the hallway, stopping briefly before heading upstairs. 3 months, he said quietly. Clara didn't move. 3 months, he repeated. But now the meaning of those words had changed completely. 3 months was no longer just about moving out of the house. It was about deciding whether their marriage would survive the truth that had finally been revealed. And Clara stood there in the middle of the living room, realizing that the one thing she tried hardest to control was now completely slipping out of her hands. The 3 months that followed were quieter than anyone expected. No more shouting. No more arguments about the house. On the surface, life inside those walls returned to something that almost looked normal. Daniel continued preparing for the move to the Pine Avenue apartment. Boxes slowly appeared in the hallway. Some evenings he packed books, clothes, and small things he had collected over the years. Clara helped sometimes, but not with the same confidence she once had. Something had changed after that night in the living room. For the first time since they married, Daniel had drawn a line that Clara could not easily move. And when a person who is usually patient finally draws a boundary, the world around them begins to reorganize itself. The house remained calm during those weeks, but beneath the calm there was a quiet transformation happening. Daniel was no longer the same man who had once followed Clara's ideas without question. He had begun thinking for himself again. And that kind of awakening is difficult to reverse. Clara noticed it too. She became more careful with her words. The certainty she once carried faded into something more cautious. But some truths, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. Daniel had seen the plan. And once someone sees the intention behind an action, every memory begins to look different. The arguments about space. The pressure to move faster. the lock on the door, the phone call on the porch. All of it had formed a picture that Daniel could no longer ignore. When the day finally arrived for him to move into the apartment, the house felt strangely peaceful. The moving truck sat quietly in the driveway while Daniel carried the last of his boxes down the hallway. Clara stood near the front door watching him. For a moment, it looked like she wanted to say something. But sometimes people realize too late that words can no longer fix what actions have already revealed. Daniel placed the final box in the truck and turned back toward the house one last time. The same house where he had grown up. The same house where everything had changed. His mother stood in the doorway, watching him quietly. And for the first time in weeks, Daniel smiled. Not because the situation had been easy, but because clarity, even when painful, brings a kind of peace that confusion never can. Before getting into the truck, Daniel said something that stayed in my mind long after the engine started. Some doors, he said, should never have been locked in the first place. And in that moment I realized something important. Clara thought the lock would give her control, but in the end, it only revealed the truth. Some doors in life reveal much more than we expect. That day, Clara believed the lock would give her control over the future. She believed one decision could quietly change the direction of the entire family. But life has a strange way of exposing the truth when people try to force things that were never meant to belong to them. The lock on that door didn't take the house. It revealed intentions. And sometimes the most important moment in a family isn't when someone wins an argument, but when someone finally sees the truth clearly for the first time. Daniel didn't leave that house because of anger. He left because clarity had arrived. And once clarity enters a person's life, pretending no longer becomes possible. Some doors open homes. Others open eyes. And the day that lock was placed on that door, it didn't secure the house. It revealed the heart.